This is question 29 from section 1 of the 2016 TSA paper. And in this question we're asked which of the options is an underlying assumption of the argument. So let's read through the argument quickly. It says the number one reason for people changing their jobs is to escape from difficult people, followed by higher pay and promotion. In particular, many people cite a poor relationship with their boss. Typically, people will go to another job and find another difficult boss, and so the process continues. So say people are repeatedly leaving jobs and getting new ones because they find their boss difficult. Or at least that's one of the main reasons why people leave jobs and find others. Then it says one of the areas that contributes to altercations with other people, so altercations basically means arguments, is unmet expectations. Says we see ourselves as being let down by the person who fails to do what we expect them to do. Then it says very often these expectations are entirely in our own heads, which it means they're not things we've said we expect. So we know we expect them, but we haven't necessarily communicated that. Then it says we put the responsibility for knowing our expectations onto the difficult person and then blame them when they disappoint us. So saying we blame people for not knowing what we expect of them, even if we're not actually helping them know what that is. And lastly, it says if only people worked towards having honest conversations with difficult people, staff turnover might decrease. So let's quickly have a look at the structure of this argument and why the writer thinks what they think, and then we can look at the assumptions they're making. Okay, so I split the argument up like this. So the writer has this sort of causal explanation for people leaving jobs, and they think it goes something like this. People don't have honest conversations, they don't share their expectations. That means that people's expectations are unmet, and that means they find the person they're working with difficult, and that means they leave their job. And they give reasons for each of these steps. So 6 and 7 support the idea that if people don't discuss honestly their expectations, then those expectations go unmet. 4 and 5 support the idea that if your expectations are unmet, that's what helps you find a person difficult, or that's what stops you getting on with the people you work with. And then the beginning of the argument supports the idea that it's finding people difficult that often leads to people leaving jobs. And the conclusion the writer makes is at the end, because this isn't supporting one of these steps, it's concluding something from this causal link between not having honest conversations and people leaving their jobs. It says if we did have honest conversations instead, then this wouldn't happen. So turnover might decrease, which means turnover means people moving between jobs. So if this didn't happen, then fewer people would leave their jobs, so there'd be less turnover. So this is what the writer thinks is happening. Let's look at the options and see which of them is an assumption they must be making. Okay, so here are my options A to E. Let's go through them one by one. So A says expectations of other people are always realistic. Is this something that's being assumed? Well, the writer doesn't talk about how realistic assumptions are at any point. They're only talking about the fact that we have them, and when they're unmet, we're unhappy. So it looks like this is talking about things the writer isn't talking about, so this isn't going to be an assumption they make. Now let's look at B. B says that difficult people are aware they're difficult. Well, how are difficult people relevant to the argument? It's that we find them difficult. Whether or not they know they're difficult isn't something the writer talks about. So this is in a similar position to A, it's just not what the writer's talking about, so it's not going to be an assumption. C says people aren't honest about their reasons for leaving a company. So how does honesty come into the argument? The writer says when people don't, the writer says people often don't share their expectations. That means they're not having open conversations about what their expectations are, and that leads to the rest of the problems. So is this something the writer's relying on? Well, we can see how it might be relevant. It doesn't immediately look like this is or it might not immediately look like this is an assumption, because it seems like the writers already supported the idea that people don't share their expectations. They say that we blame people for not knowing what we expect, even though we haven't discussed it. But actually, when the writer says that, they're only talking about how people share their expectations in general. Whereas, to be relevant to the writer's conclusion, the writer's talking about what causes people to leave their jobs, which is when they find the people they work with difficult. So the writer needs to show that in the particular case where people are leaving their job because their expectations are unmet, that people aren't having honest conversations then. But they've only shown that this often happens, not that it happens often in that particular case. So it might be it happens often in, say, less serious situations, but not so much in situations where people are about to leave their jobs. Or in other words, the writer's assuming that the process that goes on that causes people to find the people they work with so difficult they leave their jobs is the same as the process that goes on when, in general, people find their expectations unmet. So this is actually an assumption the writer's making, but it makes sense to check D and E in case there are even better options. So D says that staff turnover is damaging for a company. Well, the writer doesn't discuss anywhere what the effect on a company is, so that's just not going to be relevant. And then E says people can't be trained to have honest conversations. Well, the writer's only talking about what would happen if people did have honest conversations, not whether or not that's actually feasible. So again, this isn't an assumption that's being made. So it's clear A, B, D and D aren't the answer, and we can see eventually why C is the answer. So here our answer is going to be C. One way to think about this is actually using the negative test. So the negative test is, assume this option were false, would it make the argument no longer work? So if this were false, that would mean that people sometimes are honest about their reasons for leaving. And that would mean even though in general we don't share our expectations properly, in the case where people are about to leave, they would be having honest conversations, so this process would break down. And so this conclusion wouldn't follow. People would be having honest conversations. So trying to have more wouldn't cause turnover to decrease. So that's another reason why we might think that this is the answer.